Hello everyone, today I'm going to tell you about the strangest moment of my entire life. Picture this, your entire family gathered to mourn your death, while you're sitting in the parking lot watching it all unfold. That was me 3 weeks ago. My son had convinced everyone I'd died in a car accident while he was out of town. The tears, the flowers, the heartfelt speeches about what a loving mother I was. And then I walked in during his eulogy and said, "I'm not dead yet, but your inheritance just died." If you enjoy these real family drama stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Eleanor, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 68 years old, and 2 years ago I lost my husband of 45 years, George. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we'd managed to save up a decent nest egg over the decades. Our house was paid off, we had some land that George inherited from his father, and about $300,000 in savings and investments. Nothing extravagant, but enough for me to live comfortably for the rest of my days. My only son, Marcus, is 42 years old. He's married to a woman named Vanessa, and they have 2 children, my grandchildren, Sophie and Jake. I love those kids more than life itself, which made what happened next even more devastating. Marcus has always struggled financially. He's one of those people who's full of big dreams but can never quite make them work. In the past decade, he's tried to start a food truck business that failed within 6 months, invested in cryptocurrency and lost everything, and most recently attempted to flip houses despite having no experience in construction or real estate. Each venture left him deeper in debt, and each failure made him more desperate. Vanessa, to put it bluntly, has expensive tastes. She grew up in a wealthy family and never quite adjusted to Marcus's more modest means. She's constantly comparing their life to her friends, always wanting a bigger house, nicer cars, designer clothes for the kids. The pressure she put on Marcus to provide better was relentless. Every time they visited me, the conversation inevitably turned to the same topics. "Mom, this house is way too big for just you," Marcus would say, looking around our 4-bedroom home like it was some kind of wasteful luxury. "You're getting older and maintaining this place must be exhausting," Vanessa would add with that concerned tone that never quite rang true. "Why don't you come live with us? We could convert the garage into a nice little apartment for you," Marcus would suggest, as if moving me into their garage was some generous offer. I always politely declined. This house held 45 years of memories with George. This was where we brought Marcus home from the hospital, where we celebrated birthdays and holidays, where George took his last breath in our bedroom upstairs. I wasn't ready to leave all of that behind. But looking back now, I realize their suggestions weren't about my well-being at all. They were about my assets. They saw an elderly woman sitting on prime real estate and a substantial savings account, and they wanted access to both. What I didn't know was just how far they were willing to go to get it. The first real red flag came about 6 weeks ago. Marcus showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning with an unusually enthusiastic demeanor. "Mom, I have amazing news," he announced, practically bouncing on his heels. "I've booked you a 2-week vacation to Florida. All-inclusive resort, spa treatments, the works. You deserve to treat yourself." I was taken aback. Marcus hadn't been able to afford a vacation for his own family in years, and now he was springing for an expensive resort stay for me? "That's very generous, sweetheart, but I don't really need a vacation. I'm perfectly content here at home." "Mom, you haven't been anywhere since Dad died. This will be good for you, some sun, relaxation, maybe you'll meet some nice people your age." "I appreciate the thought, but I'd rather you spend that money on Sophie and Jake. Don't they need new school clothes?" Marcus's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "The kids are fine. This is about you taking care of yourself. I've already paid for everything and it's non-refundable." Something about his insistence felt off, but I chalked it up to him trying to be a good son. Maybe he'd gotten a bonus at work, or maybe Vanessa had finally found a job that paid well. "When is this vacation supposed to happen?" I asked. "Next week. I know it's short notice, but there was a last-minute cancellation and I jumped on it." "Next week? Marcus, I have doctor's appointments, and Mrs. Henderson next door is depending on me to water her plants while she's visiting her sister." "I'll handle all of that, Mom. You just need to pack and relax." The more he pushed, the more uncomfortable I became. But eventually, after hours of gentle pressure mixed with guilt trips about how hard he'd worked to arrange this gift, I agreed to go. The night before I was supposed to leave, my neighbor across the street, Betty Morrison, called me around 9 p.m. Ellie, honey, I don't want to worry you, but there's a moving truck in your driveway. My blood ran cold. A moving truck? Are you sure? Positive. It's one of those big U-Haul trucks, and I can see Marcus directing some men who are carrying boxes out of your house. I couldn't breathe. Betty, can you see what they're taking? It looks like furniture. I just saw them loading what looks like your dining room table. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding slightly out of breath. Hey Mom, what's up? Shouldn't you be getting your beauty sleep before your big trip tomorrow? Marcus, Betty says there's a moving truck at my house. What's going on? There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. Oh, that. I was going to surprise you. While you're gone, I'm having some of the old furniture cleaned and restored. You know, that dining room set has been looking pretty worn lately. You didn't ask me about this. I wanted it to be a surprise. When you get back, everything will look fresh and new. Something in his tone, too cheerful, too rehearsed, made my stomach churn. But I'd already committed to this vacation and I was scheduled to leave in the morning. Just, please be careful with everything. Some of those pieces belong to your grandmother. Of course, Mom. Everything will be perfect when you get back. But as I hung up the phone, I had a sinking feeling that nothing would ever be perfect again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the moving truck, about Marcus's too eager explanations, about the way Vanessa had been looking at my house during their last visit, like she was taking inventory. At 3 a.m., I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to Florida. Instead, I called Betty Morrison early the next morning. Betty, I need a huge favor. Can I stay with you for a few days? I need to see what Marcus is really up to, and I can't do that if I'm 1,000 miles away. Betty, who'd been my friend for over 20 years and had her own suspicions about Marcus's recent behavior, immediately agreed. You can stay as long as you need, honey. And we'll keep an eye on that boy of yours. I called Marcus at 7 a.m. to tell him I was heading to the airport. I even had Betty drive me past the airport so I could honestly say I'd been there, though we turned around and came back within an hour. From Betty's front window, we had a perfect view of my house. And what I saw over the next 3 days shattered every illusion I'd ever had about my son. Marcus didn't just have furniture cleaned. He emptied my house systematically, piece by piece. I watched strangers carry out my wedding china, George's tools, photo albums spanning decades of our life together. They took my mother's antique rocking chair, the grandfather clock that had been in George's family for 3 generations, even the quilts I'd made by hand over the years. On the second day, a woman in a business suit showed up with a clipboard and a camera. She walked through every room, taking measurements and photos. I recognized her from the real estate signs around town. This was Linda Crawford, one of the area's top real estate agents. My son was preparing to sell my house while I was supposedly on vacation. But it got worse. On the third day, I watched Marcus meet with 2 men in expensive suits outside my front door. One of them handed him an envelope that he opened immediately, pulling out what looked like official documents. He signed something, shook hands with both men, and they left. That evening, Betty and I watched as Marcus hung a for sale sign in my front yard. That son of a bitch, Betty muttered, forgetting her usual polite language. Ellie, he's selling your house out from under you. I felt numb. This was my son, the baby I'd rocked to sleep, the boy I'd bandaged scraped knees for, the young man I'd helped through college. And he was stealing my life. But I still had no idea how far his betrayal would go. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Robert Chen, from Betty's house. Robert had handled George's estate and had been our family attorney for 15 years. Robert, I need to ask you something, and it might sound crazy. Can my son sell my house without my permission? Absolutely not, Eleanor. Not unless you've given him power of attorney, which I know you haven't. Why do you ask? I explained what I'd witnessed over the past few days. Robert was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Eleanor, this is very serious. If Marcus is attempting to sell property that doesn't belong to him, that's fraud. But for him to have gotten this far, he must have some kind of documentation that makes it appear legal. What kind of documentation? The most common scenario would be a forged power of attorney or… He paused. Or he's had you declared dead. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dead? It's rare, but it happens. Usually in cases involving inheritance disputes or insurance fraud. If he could produce a death certificate, even a fake one, he could potentially claim the property as your heir. I thought about the men in suits, the envelope, the documents Marcus had signed. Robert, how would I find out if I've been declared dead? Let me make some calls. Stay by the phone. An hour later, Robert called back. His voice was grim. Eleanor, I'm afraid my suspicions were correct. According to the State Vital Records Office, you died 4 days ago in a car accident in Pensacola, Florida. The room started spinning. I had to sit down. But I'm alive. I'm talking to you right now. I know that and you know that. But legally, officially, Eleanor Morrison died in Florida while on vacation. The death certificate was filed by the Pensacola County Coroner's Office. How is that possible? Someone would have had to pay off the right people, provide false identification of a body, and file fraudulent paperwork. It's not easy to do, but it's not impossible if you have enough money and the right connections. So what happens now? Now your son is legally your heir. He can sell your property, access your bank accounts, even collect on your life insurance policies. Eleanor, you need to come forward immediately. Every day you wait makes this situation more complicated. What if I gather evidence first? What if I let him dig his own grave a little deeper? Robert was quiet for a moment. That's actually not a bad idea. The more evidence we have of his fraud, the stronger our case will be. But Eleanor, this is dangerous. If he's willing to have you declared dead for money, what else might he be willing to do? I thought about my sweet grandchildren, about the man I'd raised from birth, about the family dinners and Christmas mornings and bedtime stories. Then I thought about the moving truck and the real estate sign and the forged death certificate. I want to see how far he'll take this, I said finally. I want to catch him in the act. Then we'll need to be very careful about how we do this. Over the next week, I became a spy in my own life. Betty's house provided the perfect surveillance point, and together we documented everything. We watched as prospective buyers toured my house with Linda Crawford. We photographed Marcus meeting with insurance agents, bank officials, and what appeared to be funeral directors. We even followed him to the Department of Motor Vehicles, where he transferred my car registration into his name. But the most heartbreaking moment came when I watched him load my personal belongings, photo albums, George's military medals, my grandmother's jewelry into his own car. These weren't things he could sell for significant money. These were memories, family heirlooms, irreplaceable pieces of our shared history. He was erasing me completely. On Wednesday afternoon, Marcus posted something on Facebook that made my blood boil. It is with heavy hearts that Vanessa and I announce the passing of my beloved mother, Eleanor Morrison. She died peacefully in Florida after suffering a sudden heart attack while on vacation. She was 68 years old and will be deeply missed by all who knew her. Funeral arrangements to follow. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from friends, neighbors, and distant relatives expressing their condolences. People I'd known for years were mourning my death, and here I was, very much alive, reading their kind words from Betty's living room. The comments were both touching and infuriating. Eleanor was such a sweet woman. She always had time for everyone. I can't believe she's gone. Just saw her at the grocery store last month. Marcus, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your mother was a wonderful woman. She raised you well, Marcus. She'd be proud of the man you've become. That last comment almost made me throw Betty's laptop across the room. Proud? Of a son who'd had me declared dead so he could steal my life's work? But I forced myself to stay calm. Robert had advised me to let Marcus dig his hole as deep as possible before revealing myself. Every fraudulent action he took made our eventual legal case stronger. Thursday brought a new development: funeral arrangements. I watched through Betty's window as a black hearse pulled up to my house. Marcus came out to meet the funeral director, and they spent almost an hour discussing details. Later that day, another Facebook post appeared. Thank you all for your kind words about my mother's passing. The funeral will be held this Saturday at 7 p.m. at St. Mark's Community Church. In lieu of flowers, please consider donations to the American Heart Association. My own funeral. My son was planning my own funeral. This is insane, Betty muttered as we read the post together. Ellie, you have to stop this before it goes any further. But I wasn't ready to stop it yet. I wanted to see this performance through to its conclusion. I wanted to witness firsthand just how convincing my son could be when he was lying to people who loved me. I wanted to attend my own funeral. Friday was a whirlwind of activity. From Betty's window, we watched as Marcus transformed himself into the grieving son. He wore black, moved slowly, and dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief whenever neighbors stopped by to offer condolences. Vanessa played her part too, bringing casseroles to their house, presumably from well-meaning friends, arranging flowers, and making phone calls about the service. She even posted her own Facebook tribute. Eleanor was more than a mother-in-law to me, she was a second mother. Her kindness, wisdom, and unconditional love will be missed every day. Rest in peace, Mom. We love you. Reading that made me physically nauseated. This woman who'd barely tolerated me, who'd made countless snide comments about my old-fashioned ways and my outdated house, was now claiming I was like a mother to her. But the real test of their acting abilities came when people started calling to offer help with funeral arrangements. I listened through Betty's window as Marcus stood on my front porch, talking to our longtime neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was in her 80s and had been my close friend for over a decade. "Oh, Marcus," she said, her voice shaky with grief, "I just can't believe your mother is gone. She was so healthy, so full of life." "What happened?" "It was very sudden," Marcus replied, his voice perfectly modulated with grief. "The doctors said it was a massive heart attack. She didn't suffer. But she seemed fine when I saw her last week. We were talking about planting bulbs together this fall." "I know, Mrs. Patterson. That's what makes this so hard. She was looking forward to coming home from her vacation and getting back to her garden." Mrs. Patterson started crying then, and Marcus actually put his arm around her shoulders to comfort her. The irony was staggering. Here he was, consoling someone for the death he'd fabricated, playing the role of supportive son to perfection. "Is there anything I can do?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "I could bring food, help with cleaning, anything you need." "That's very kind, but we're managing. The most important thing is that she has a beautiful service. She deserves that." After Mrs. Patterson left, I watched Marcus stand on the porch for a moment, looking out at the neighborhood. For just a second, his mask slipped, and I saw something in his expression that chilled me. Not grief, not remorse, satisfaction. He was enjoying this. That evening, Betty and I drove past St. Mark's Church to see the preparations. There was already a sign out front, "In memory of Eleanor Morrison, 1955 to 2023, service Saturday 7 p.m. Seeing my own name on a funeral announcement was surreal beyond description. According to that sign, I had lived and died, and tomorrow people would gather to say goodbye to me. Except I wasn't going anywhere. Saturday dawned gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for a funeral, even a fake one. I spent the morning in Betty's living room, watching Marcus prepare for the biggest performance of his life. He was up early, getting dressed in a black suit I'd bought him 2 years ago for George's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me, he was wearing my gift to mourn my supposedly death. Vanessa emerged from the house in a black dress and heels, looking appropriately somber. She carried a small purse and what appeared to be a packet of tissues. Even from a distance, I could see that she'd done her makeup to look like she'd been crying. At noon, a florist's van arrived and began unloading arrangements. I counted at least a dozen bouquets and wreaths. Someone had spent serious money on flowers for my fake funeral. Given Marcus's financial situation, I wondered who was footing the bill. Then I remembered I was. These flowers were being paid for with money from my own bank accounts, which Marcus now had access to thanks to my fraudulent death certificate. Around 2 p.m. the hearse arrived. I watched in horrified fascination as Marcus met with the funeral director and helped load what appeared to be a casket into the vehicle. "Whose body is in there?" Betty wondered aloud. "I don't think there is a body," I replied. "The casket is probably empty, or maybe filled with weights to make it feel realistic. Marcus wouldn't have access to an actual corpse." The thought was both reassuring and deeply disturbing. My son was so committed to this fraud that he'd arranged for an empty casket to be transported to my funeral. At 4 p.m., Marcus and Vanessa left the house, following the hearse toward the church. I waited until they were out of sight, then turned to Betty. "It's time. Ellie, are you absolutely sure about this? Once you walk into that church, there's no going back." I thought about everything I'd witnessed over the past week. The systematic theft of my belongings, the forged death certificate, the elaborate funeral charade. Most of all, I thought about the satisfied look on Marcus's face when he'd comforted Mrs. Patterson. "I'm sure. My son thinks he can erase me and steal my life. It's time to show him that I'm not as easy to get rid of as he thinks." Betty drove me to St. Mark's Church at 6:30 p.m. The parking lot was nearly full. It looked like half the town had come to pay their respects to my supposedly deceased self. I had Betty drop me off at the back of the building, near the church's community garden where I'd volunteered for years. From there, I could see into the main sanctuary through the tall windows that lined the side of the building. The scene inside was both touching and infuriating. The church was packed with people I'd known for decades, neighbors, friends from my book club, fellow volunteers from various charities, even some folks I hadn't seen in years. They'd all come to honor my memory, and they were all being deceived by my son. At the front of the church sat an elegant casket surrounded by flowers. Marcus and Vanessa were in the front row, along with Sophie and Jake, my grandchildren. The kids looked genuinely confused and sad. They clearly had no idea this was all an elaborate lie. Pastor Williams, who'd officiated at George's funeral 2 years earlier, stood at the pulpit reading from Psalms. I could see people dabbing at their eyes with tissues, and several were openly crying. These people loved me. They'd taken time out of their lives to come say goodbye to me, and they were genuinely grieving my loss. Meanwhile, the person they were mourning was standing outside in the church garden, very much alive and planning to expose the entire charade. At 7:15, Pastor Williams invited people to share memories of me. One by one, friends and neighbors stood up to tell stories about my life. Mrs. Patterson spoke about how I'd helped her with her grocery shopping after her husband died. My book club president talked about my insights during our discussions and how I always brought the best snacks to meetings. A young mother from the neighborhood described how I'd babysat her children during emergencies and never accepted payment. Each story was a reminder of the life I'd built, the relationships I'd cultivated, the small ways I'd tried to make a difference in my community. And each story made Marcus's betrayal more painful. Then it was Marcus's turn to speak. He walked slowly to the podium, his shoulders slumped with apparent grief. He placed a folded piece of paper on the lectern and looked out at the congregation with eyes that glistened with what appeared to be tears. "My mother, Eleanor Morrison," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "was the most selfless person I've ever known." I almost snorted. Selfless? He was describing me as selfless while stealing everything I owned? "She dedicated her entire life to taking care of others," he continued. "First my father, then me, and in recent years, anyone in our community who needed help. She never asked for anything in return." That part was true, at least. I had spent my life taking care of others. Including him. "Mom taught me that family is everything," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "She showed me that love means sacrifice, that you put the people you care about before yourself always." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He was using my own values, the very selflessness he was now praising, to justify stealing from me. "She wasn't ready to go," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "She had so many plans for the future. She wanted to travel, to spend more time with her grandchildren, to see them graduate and get married and have children of their own." For the first time, genuine emotion crept into his voice. Because this part was true, I did want all those things. And his actions had stolen them from me, just as surely as if I had actually died. "But I know she's at peace now," Marcus concluded. "She's with Dad again, and she's free from the worries and struggles of this world. She leaves behind a legacy of love, kindness, and generosity that will live on in all of us." The congregation murmured approval. Several people were crying openly now. Even I felt a pang of emotion because despite everything, Marcus had captured something true about who I was and who I'd tried to be. But then he said something that changed everything, and I know that wherever she is, she's watching over us, making sure we're taken care of. That's just who she was, always putting her family first, always making sure we had what we needed to succeed. He paused, scanning the congregation with what looked like genuine gratitude. "My mother's greatest gift to us wasn't just her love, it was her foresight. She made sure that even in death, she could continue to provide for her family. The house she and Dad built together, the savings they accumulated over decades of hard work, she wanted all of that to go towards securing my children's future." My blood boiled. He was turning my death into a gift I'd given him. He was making my supposed generosity the justification for his theft. "She used to say that money was just a tool," Marcus continued, "and that the only thing that mattered was using that tool to take care of the people you love. Well, Mom, we promised to honor that wish. We promised to use what you've left us to build the kind of life you always wanted us to have." That was it. I couldn't listen to another word. I walked around to the front of the church, pulled open the heavy wooden doors, and stepped inside. At first, nobody noticed me. The church was dimly lit, and I was just another figure silhouetted in the doorway. Marcus was still speaking, his back to the entrance as he faced the congregation. I started walking down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. A few people in the back rows turned to look at the late arrival. I saw recognition dawn on their faces, followed immediately by confusion, then shock. "Is that?" someone whispered. "It can't be," came the reply. I kept walking. More heads turned. A murmur began to spread through the congregation like ripples on a pond. Marcus, still focused on his eulogy, didn't notice the disturbance at first. He was saying something about how my memory would live on forever when the whispers reached a volume that finally caught his attention. He paused mid-sentence and turned to see what was causing the commotion. Our eyes met across the length of the church. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The murmur in the congregation grew louder. People were standing up now, craning their necks to get a better look. "Eleanor?" Pastor Williams called out from behind the pulpit, his voice filled with disbelief. I continued walking until I reached the front of the church, stopping just a few feet from the casket that supposedly contained my remains. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I'm sorry to interrupt my own funeral, but I thought you should know, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." The church erupted. People gasped, shouted, pointed. Several elderly congregation members looked like they might be having heart attacks of their own. "Eleanor?" Mrs. Patterson cried out from the middle of the church. "But how?" "We thought," Marcus said. All eyes turned to Marcus, who was still standing frozen at the podium. His carefully crafted grief had vanished, replaced by naked terror. "Marcus," I said, turning to face him directly, "would you like to explain to all these nice people why they're attending a funeral for someone who's very much alive?" "Mom," he stammered, "There must be some mistake." "The hospital said." "What hospital, Marcus?" "I was never in any hospital. I was never in Florida. I've been staying with Betty Morrison for the past week, watching you sell my belongings and forge documents to steal my life." The congregation was in chaos now. People were talking over each other, demanding explanations, expressing shock and outrage. "You said she died in a car accident," someone shouted. "We brought flowers. We've been mourning her for days," called out another voice. Vanessa, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood up. "This is impossible," she said, her voice shrill with panic. "Eleanor, you're supposed to be. I mean, we thought you were dead?" I supplied helpfully. "Yes, I gathered that from the death certificate Marcus filed. The same death certificate he used to access my bank accounts and put my house on the market." More gasps from the congregation. Betty Morrison, who had slipped in during the commotion, was documenting everything with her phone. Pastor Williams stepped down from the pulpit, approaching me cautiously as if I might be a ghost who could disappear at any moment. "Eleanor, my dear, we're all confused. Marcus told us you'd passed away in Florida. We've been planning this service for days." "I know," I said gently. Pastor Williams was innocent in all this, he'd been deceived just like everyone else. And I'm grateful that so many people cared enough to come say goodbye to me. It's heartwarming to know how much love there is in this room. I turned back to Marcus, who was now visibly shaking. "What I don't understand, son, is why you felt the need to kill me off in order to steal from me. If you needed help, why didn't you just ask?" "We were desperate," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "The debts, the pressure. Vanessa said her parents would help if we could just." "If you could just what?" "Murder your mother and steal her life savings." "I didn't murder you," he protested, finding his voice again. "You're right here." "No, Marcus. You murdered the Eleanor Morrison who trusted you, who would have done anything to help her son and grandchildren. That woman is dead. You killed her when you decided I was worth more to you as a corpse than as a mother." The next hour was controlled chaos. Someone had called the police, and they arrived to find a church full of confused mourners and one very much alive woman who was supposed to be dead. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who took charge of the scene, had clearly never encountered anything quite like this before. "So let me get this straight," she said, consulting her notes. Mr. Morrison filed a fraudulent death certificate for his mother, sold her belongings, listed her house for sale, and held a funeral, all while she was alive and watching from across the street. That's correct, I confirmed. And you have evidence of all this? Betty stepped forward with her phone and a thick folder of documents. Photos, videos, copies of the forged paperwork, bank records showing unauthorized access to Eleanor's accounts. We documented everything. Detective Rodriguez looked at Marcus, who was sitting in a pew with his head in his hands. Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and attempted theft of property. You have the right to remain silent. As they read him his rights, I felt no satisfaction, only sadness. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined. This was the end of my relationship with my son, possibly forever. Vanessa was arrested as well. Her fingerprints were on several of the forged documents, and she'd been actively involved in selling my belongings. The children were taken by Child Protective Services pending placement with Vanessa's parents. The congregation slowly dispersed, most people still in shock over what they'd witnessed. Many stopped to hug me and express their relief that I was alive, but I could see the questions in their eyes. How could a son do this to his mother? How could anyone be so callous? Mrs. Patterson was one of the last to leave. She gripped my hands tightly, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor, I'm so glad you're alive, but I'm so sorry this happened to you. That boy. I thought I knew him. We all did, I replied. But people can surprise you. And not always in good ways. What will you do now? I looked around the church at the flowers that had been meant for my funeral, at the casket that had been meant to hold my body, at the program with my name and dates that marked a life that wasn't actually over. I'm going to go home, I said. I'm going to reclaim my life. And I'm going to remember that being alive is a gift, even when the people who are supposed to love you try to take it away. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Marcus's fraud was so well documented that his lawyer advised him to plead guilty rather than face trial. The charges were serious: identity theft, fraud, forgery of official documents, theft of property, and conspiracy. Together, they carried a potential sentence of up to 15 years in prison. In the end, Marcus was sentenced to 8 years, with the possibility of parole in 5. Vanessa received 3 years for her role in the scheme. They were also ordered to pay full restitution for everything they'd stolen, though given their financial situation, I knew I'd never see most of that money. The most heartbreaking part of the legal process was when the prosecutor explained exactly how elaborate Marcus's plan had been. He'd spent months setting it up, creating false identities, bribing officials in Florida to file fraudulent paperwork, even hiring actors to play the role of witnesses to my supposed accident. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, the prosecutor told me during one of our meetings. This was a carefully planned operation designed to permanently erase you from existence so he could inherit your assets. If you hadn't discovered what was happening, you would have found yourself legally dead with no way to reclaim your identity or your property. The thought chilled me. If I'd actually gone to Florida as planned, I would have returned to find myself erased. No bank accounts, no house, no legal existence. I would have been a ghost in my own life. But there was one aspect of the legal proceedings that brought me unexpected comfort: the judge's comments during sentencing. Mr. Morrison, Judge Patricia Valdez said, looking down at Marcus with obvious disgust, in 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a crime that represents such a profound betrayal of trust. The victim in this case isn't just any elderly person, she's your mother. The woman who gave you life, who raised you, who sacrificed for you. And you repaid that love by trying to erase her existence for financial gain. Marcus stood before the bench in his orange jumpsuit, his head bowed. He'd lost weight during the months of legal proceedings, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished. What makes this crime particularly heinous, the judge continued, is the psychological torture you inflicted. Mrs. Morrison had to watch as you systematically dismantled her life while pretending to grieve her death. She had to endure seeing friends and neighbors mourn her while you played the role of the devoted son. The emotional damage of such betrayal is incalculable. I sat in the gallery watching my son receive his sentence, and I felt empty. Not vindicated, not satisfied, just hollow. This man in handcuffs wasn't the little boy I'd raised. Somewhere along the way, that child had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. However, Judge Valdez added. "I want to commend Mrs. Morrison for her courage and intelligence in exposing this fraud. Many elderly victims of financial abuse never get justice because they're too ashamed to come forward or because the perpetrators are family members they can't bear to prosecute. Mrs. Morrison chose justice over misplaced loyalty, and because of that choice, she saved herself and sent a clear message that elder abuse will not be tolerated in this community." After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine. Betty was waiting for me by her car, along with Mrs. Patterson and several other neighbors who'd supported me throughout the ordeal. "How do you feel?" Betty asked. I thought about it for a moment. Like I can finally start living again. Returning to my house after everything that had happened was surreal. The police had recovered most of my belongings from various locations where Marcus had stored or sold them, but the house still felt violated somehow. Every room held memories of watching strangers carry away pieces of my life. I spent the first week just cleaning and rearranging, trying to make the space feel like mine again. Some things were irreplaceable: photo albums that had been damaged, George's tools that were never recovered, family heirlooms that had been sold to pawn shops and disappeared into the ether. But slowly, the house began to feel like home again. I made changes too. I updated my will to leave everything to charity, ensuring that no one would ever again be motivated to harm me for financial gain. I installed a security system and gave spare keys only to Betty and my lawyer. I opened new bank accounts and put additional safeguards in place to prevent unauthorized access. Most importantly, I started living for myself instead of for others. I joined a travel group for seniors and took the Florida vacation I'd never actually gone on. I learned to paint watercolors, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was taking care of everyone else. I volunteered at a local organization that helped elderly victims of financial abuse, sharing my story to help others recognize the warning signs. The grandchildren were the hardest part. Sophie and Jake had been placed with Vanessa's parents after the arrest, and the whole situation had been traumatic for them. They'd lost both parents to prison and discovered that their grandmother's death had been a lie their father had told them. I wanted to maintain a relationship with them, but their maternal grandparents were understandably protective and suspicious. It took months of supervised visits and family counseling before I was allowed to spend time with Sophie and Jake alone. The first time they came to stay with me for a weekend, Sophie, who was now 10, asked the question I'd been dreading. "Grandma Ellie, why did Daddy try to pretend you were dead?" I sat down beside her on the couch, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people make very bad choices when they're scared or desperate. Your daddy was worried about money, and he thought taking my things would solve his problems. But he was wrong, and he hurt a lot of people with his choices." "Did he hurt you?" "Yes, he did. But not in the way you might think. He didn't hit me or yell at me. He hurt my feelings and broke my trust. Sometimes that kind of hurt is worse than physical pain." Jake, who was 8 and had been quieter about the whole situation, looked up from the toy he was playing with. "Are you still mad at Daddy?" That was the question I'd been asking myself for months. Was I still angry? Yes, sometimes. Was I hurt? Absolutely. But was I consumed by those feelings? No, not anymore. "I'm sad about what your daddy did," I told him honestly. "And I'm disappointed in the choices he made. But I'm not going to let those feelings ruin my life. I'd rather focus on the good things, like spending time with you too." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. And slowly, over many months of visits and conversations, I began to build new relationships with my grandchildren, relationships based on truth rather than the lies their father had told. 2 years after the trial, I was working in my garden on a warm spring morning when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. I straightened up, brushing soil from my gloves, and watched as a woman about my age stepped out. She was well-dressed but nervous, fidgeting with her purse as she approached. "Mrs. Morrison?" She called out. "I'm Linda Torres. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes." I didn't recognize the name, but something about her demeanor suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Of course," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves. "Would you like to come inside? I was just about to make some tea." "That would be lovely." We settled in my kitchen, and Linda accepted a cup of chamomile tea with shaking hands. "I'm not sure how to begin this," she said finally. "I saw your story on the news 2 years ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. You see, I think my son might be planning something similar." My blood chilled. "What makes you think that?" Little things at first. He's been asking a lot of questions about my finances, my health insurance, whether I have a will. He's suggested I might be happier in a retirement community, that maintaining my house is too much work for someone my age. The parallels were unmistakable. How old is your son? 38. He's married, has 2 children, and they're struggling financially. His wife has expensive tastes and they're deep in debt. Have you noticed any suspicious activity? Documents you didn't sign? Changes to your accounts? Linda nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Last week I found out he'd taken out a life insurance policy on me. A big one. When I confronted him about it, he said it was just a precaution, that he wanted to make sure funeral expenses would be covered. But the policy is for $750,000. That's a lot more than any funeral would cost. I set down my teacup carefully. Linda, you need to protect yourself immediately. Do you have a lawyer? I do, but I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting. He's my son. Surely he wouldn't. That's exactly what I thought, I interrupted gently. That's what every parent thinks. We raise these children. We love them. We can't imagine they would hurt us. But sometimes love isn't enough to overcome desperation or greed. I spent the next hour telling Linda everything: how to secure her accounts, how to protect her legal documents, how to gather evidence if she suspected fraud. I gave her my lawyer's contact information and the number for Adult Protective Services. Most importantly, I said as she prepared to leave, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone convince you that you're being paranoid or difficult. Your safety and security matter more than preserving family relationships. Linda hugged me tightly before she left. Thank you, she whispered. I was so scared and I felt so alone. It helps to know someone else has been through this and survived. After she drove away, I realized something had changed for me. My ordeal with Marcus, as painful as it had been, had given me a purpose. I could help other people recognize the warning signs, protect themselves, and reclaim their lives if necessary. I started speaking at senior centers and community groups about elder financial abuse. I worked with law enforcement to help train officers on how to recognize and investigate these crimes. I even testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections for elderly citizens. My story, as horrible as it had been to live through, was helping other people avoid the same fate. 3 years after his sentencing, I received a letter from Marcus. It was the first direct communication I'd had from him since the trial, and I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was his, but it looked different somehow, smaller, more careful, as if he'd lost the bold confidence that had once characterized everything he did. Dear Mom, I know I have no right to write to you, and I'll understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I needed to try to explain, not to make excuses for what I did, but to help you understand how I became someone capable of such betrayal. I've had 3 years to think about what I did to you, and I've come to realize that my actions weren't just about money or desperation. They were about entitlement. Somewhere along the way, I started to believe that your love for me meant I was owed your life, your resources, your very existence. I stopped seeing you as a person with your own needs and desires. You became, in my mind, an extension of me, there to serve my purposes, to solve my problems, to sacrifice for my comfort. When you wouldn't voluntarily give me what I thought I deserved, I decided to take it. The money was part of it, yes. But it was more than that. I was angry that you were living your own life instead of dedicating everything to making mine easier. I was angry that you had choices when I felt trapped by my circumstances. What I did was unforgivable. I erased you, not just legally but emotionally. I turned your love into a weapon against you and used your own kindness to justify stealing your life. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that prison has taught me something I should have learned decades ago. You don't owe me anything. You never did. The fact that you gave me life, raised me, loved me, those were gifts, not debts that needed to be repaid. I hope you're happy. I hope you're living the life you want, surrounded by people who see your worth and treat you with the respect you deserve. I hope my actions haven't made you afraid to trust or love again. And I hope that someday, when I get out of here, I can become the kind of person who would make you proud again. Not because I expect anything from you, but because you deserved so much better than the son I became. With love and profound regret, Marcus. I read the letter 3 times, my emotions cycling through anger, sadness, and something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. Not forgiveness for what he'd done, that was unforgivable. But perhaps forgiveness for who he'd been before he became someone capable of such cruelty. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't write back, but I didn't throw it away either. It was an acknowledgement, an apology, and maybe the first step toward him becoming someone different. Whether that transformation would ever be complete, whether we would ever have any kind of relationship again, remained to be seen. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I had hoped that the little boy I'd raised might still exist somewhere inside the man who'd betrayed me. As I sit here today, 5 years after attending my own funeral, I'm struck by how completely my life has changed. I'm 73 now, and I've never felt more alive or more purposeful. The woman who stood in that church and declared herself not dead yet has become someone I never expected to be: an advocate, a speaker, a force for change in the fight against elder abuse. My story has been featured in newspapers, magazines, and television shows. I've spoken to thousands of people about the warning signs of financial exploitation and the importance of protecting yourself, even from family members. The organization I help run has prevented dozens of similar schemes and helped victims recover millions of dollars in stolen assets. But the personal victory is just as important as the public one. I've reclaimed not just my legal identity and my financial assets, but my sense of self-worth and autonomy. I make my own decisions, live my own life, and answer to no one but myself. Marcus was released from prison 6 months ago. He served 4.5 years of his 8-year sentence. He's living in a halfway house 2 states away and working as a maintenance worker at a small company that hires ex-convicts. He's written me several more letters over the years, and slowly, carefully, I've begun to write back. Our correspondence is cordial but distant. We're both different people now than we were 5 years ago, and we're still figuring out if there's any relationship possible between these new versions of ourselves. I've seen Sophie and Jake regularly over the years. They're teenagers now. Sophie is 15 and Jake is 13. They've grown into thoughtful, compassionate young people despite the trauma they experienced. We have honest conversations about what their father did and why, and I try to help them understand that love and betrayal can coexist in the same person. They know their father made terrible choices, but they also know I don't want them to hate him. Hate is a poison that hurts the person carrying it more than the person it's directed toward, and I've worked too hard to reclaim my life to let hate pollute it now. Vanessa was released after 18 months and has since remarried. She's had no contact with me since the trial, which is fine with both of us. The house where all this began is still my home, but it's been transformed. The rooms that once felt violated by strangers carrying away my belongings are now filled with new memories. Dinner parties with friends, art classes held in the living room, grandchildren doing homework at the kitchen table. I've made peace with what happened, not because I've forgotten or because I think it was somehow meant to be, but because holding on to anger and hurt was preventing me from fully living. Marcus stole 5 months of my life with his scheme, but I wasn't going to let him steal the rest of it with bitterness. If you've listened to this entire story, you might be wondering what the point is. Why share such a painful, personal betrayal with strangers? Why relive the worst experience of my life for the entertainment of others? The answer is simple: because silence protects predators and my story might save someone else's life. Elder abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in America. Most victims never come forward because they're ashamed, because they don't want to get family members in trouble, or because they don't think anyone will believe them. They suffer in silence while their abusers get away with theft, fraud, and emotional torture. But silence serves no one except the people committing these crimes. If you're an older person and someone in your family is pressuring you to sign documents you don't understand, asking suspicious questions about your finances, or trying to isolate you from friends and support systems, trust your instincts. You are not being paranoid. You are not being difficult. You are being smart. If you're an adult child reading this and thinking about how much easier your life would be if you had access to your parents' resources, let me be clear: their money is not your inheritance until they die naturally. Their house is not your property until they choose to give it to you. Their lives are not yours to control or manipulate for your convenience. And if you're someone who loves an older person and you suspect they're being abused or exploited, speak up. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't tell yourself it's none of your business. It takes a community to protect our most vulnerable members, and your voice might be the one that saves someone's life. My son thought he could erase me and steal my life because he believed I was powerless, alone, and naive. He was wrong on all counts. I had more strength than he imagined, more support than he realized, and more intelligence than he gave me credit for. But most importantly, I had something he couldn't take away no matter how many documents he forged or lies he told: my will to survive. I may have attended my own funeral, but I walked out of that church more alive than I'd ever been. And every day since then has been a gift, not because someone gave it to me, but because I chose to claim it for myself. To anyone who has ever been told they're too old, too trusting, too set in their ways, or too anything to live life on their own terms, I want you to remember this: you are the author of your own story. Don't let anyone else pick up the pen. And to those who might be tempted to exploit someone's love for financial gain, remember that love given freely can also be withdrawn completely. The person you're betraying today might be the one who exposes you tomorrow. Because some of us old ladies are a lot tougher than we look. And we're definitely not as naive as you think. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found it helpful or inspiring, please share it with others who might need to hear it. And remember, as long as you're breathing, you have the power to change your story. Take care of yourselves out there. And never, ever let anyone convince you that your life is worth less than their greed.